The silk screen slid shut with barely a whisper. But what happened behind it would haunt Japan's most guarded secrets for centuries. She was only 16 when they painted her face white for the first time, unaware that beneath the powder and perfume lay a world where beauty was currency, survival was art, and silence was the only rule that mattered. What the world thought it knew about geishas was just the beginning of a much darker story. The silk screen slid shut with barely a whisper. But what happened behind it would haunt Japan's most guarded secrets for centuries. She was only 16 when they painted her face white for the first time, unaware that beneath the powder and perfume lay a world where beauty was currency, survival was art, and silence was the only rule that mattered. What the world thought it knew about geishas was just the beginning of a much darker story. Yukiko's hands trembled as the older woman, the Oka-san, the mother of the house, lifted the brush loaded with white powder. The smell was chalky, medicinal, nothing like the delicate fragrances she had imagined. Through the paper walls, she could hear the distant sound of shamisen music, the soft shuffle of tabi socks on tatami mats, and something else, a sound she couldn't quite identify. Later, she would recognize it as the sound of women crying, very quietly, so no one would hear. The transformation took 2 hours. Layer by layer, Yukiko's natural face disappeared beneath the mask that would define her existence. The Oka-san worked in silence, occasionally making small sounds of approval or disappointment. When she finally held up the mirror, Yukiko stared at a stranger, a porcelain doll with painted lips and eyes that seemed to hold secrets she hadn't learned yet. "Beautiful," the Oka-san murmured, but there was something cold in her voice, like a merchant appraising valuable goods. "The gentleman will be very pleased." Outside, beyond the carefully tended gardens and ornate wooden buildings of the Hanamachi district, the world was changing. It was 1890, and the Meiji Restoration had opened Japan to the west. Foreign diplomats and businessmen walked the streets of Kyoto, their tall frames and strange clothing drawing curious stares. Some of them had heard stories about the mysterious geishas, the artists and entertainers who represented the most refined aspects of Japanese culture. What they didn't know, what most of the world didn't know, was that the silk screens and painted faces hid a system that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with commerce, human commerce. Yukiko had arrived at the Okiya 3 days earlier, brought by her father in a transaction that took less than 10 minutes. The debt papers were signed before she fully understood what was happening. Her father needed money for medicine for her dying mother. The Okiyoshi needed a new girl to replace the one who had, as she put it delicately, gone away in the night. The amount of the debt was staggering, enough to feed a family for 5 years, enough to buy a small house. Yukiko would work until it was paid off, plus interest, plus room and board, plus the cost of her training, her kimonos, her makeup, her shamisen lessons. The mathematics were designed to be impossible. Most girls who entered the system never left. As night fell over the district, Yukiko was led to a small room barely larger than a closet. Her futon was thin, the blanket rough. Through the walls she could hear the sounds of the evening beginning. The arrival of clients, the rustle of expensive silk, the artificial laughter that sounded like breaking glass. The Oka-san appeared in her doorway one last time that night. "Remember," she said, her voice soft but unmistakably threatening. "You are no longer Yukiko. You are whoever the house needs you to be. Your old life is gone. Your family is gone. We are your family now." The door slid shut, and Yukiko was alone with her white face and her impossible debt. She touched her painted cheek and felt nothing. The powder was so thick it might as well have been a mask, which, she was beginning to understand, was exactly what it was. But what she couldn't have known, what none of the girls could have known, was that the real secrets of the geisha houses had nothing to do with tea ceremonies or classical dance. The real secrets were buried so deep that even today, more than a century later, most of them have never been told. The ledger book sat open on the Oka-san's desk like a tomb of dreams. Each page contained names, ages, and numbers, cold mathematics that reduced human lives to profit margins. Yukiko's name was there now, written in careful brushstrokes, followed by a sum that might as well have been written in blood. The debt system wasn't an accident or side effect of the geisha world. It was the foundation upon which the entire structure was built, as deliberate and calculated as any banking operation. Every Okiya operated on the same principle: acquire girls as young as possible, create insurmountable debt, and extract maximum value before age and wear made them worthless. The most valuable commodity wasn't their artistic skills or their conversation, it was something much more primal. Something that could only be sold once but commanded prices that staggered even wealthy merchants. The mizuage ceremony, the ritual deflowering of a maiko, could cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. Kenji Nakamura owned 3 textile factories and had enough money to buy half of Kyoto, but he had never owned something as precious as what sat trembling behind the silk screen in the Willow House Okiya. 16-year-old Sakura had been training for 3 years, her every movement sculpted into perfection, her innocence preserved like a rare wine waiting for the perfect moment to be opened. The bidding had been discreet but fierce. Wealthy merchants, government officials, even a foreign diplomat, had sent representatives to assess the girl and make their offers. The final price was enough to support the entire Okiya for 2 years, and Sakura would see none of it. It would simply be added to her debt, ensuring she could never buy her freedom. What happened in that room was never spoken of outside the Okiya walls, but the screams that echoed through the building that night told their own story. By morning, Sakura was no longer a maiko. She was a commodity that had been successfully liquidated, and her debt had magically increased rather than decreased. The mathematics were always impossible, by design. A girl's initial purchase price might be 50 yen, but by the time the Okasan added training costs, clothing, food, makeup and interest compounded monthly, the debt swelled like a malignant tumor. Even the most successful geisha rarely earned enough to make meaningful progress against what they owed. Worse still, the houses employed creative accounting that would have impressed the most corrupt bankers. If a girl became ill and couldn't work, medical costs were added to her debt. If she displeased a client, fines were levied. If she tried to escape, the cost of finding and returning her was added to her burden. Some girls saw their debts actually increase with each passing year, despite working every night until exhaustion claimed them. The system extended beyond individual Okiya houses into a network that resembled organized crime more than cultural tradition. Girls who showed signs of rebellion were sometimes sold to establishments in distant cities, separated forever from anyone who might help them. Those who became too troublesome simply disappeared, their names scratched from the ledgers as if they had never existed. Behind the elaborate ceremonies and refined arts, the geisha districts operated like a sophisticated slave trade. Parents who sold their daughters told themselves they were providing opportunity, a chance for their child to learn prestigious skills and associate with wealthy, educated men. The reality was that they were selling their daughters into sexual slavery with a veneer of cultural respectability. The girls themselves often didn't understand the true nature of their situation until it was too late. They were told they were artists in training, that they would learn to pour tea and play shamisen and dance with the grace of butterflies. Only gradually did they realize that their bodies were the real product being sold, and their artistic skills were merely elaborate packaging. Even the tea ceremonies held dark secrets. The powdered green tea wasn't always just tea, depending on the client's preferences and willingness to pay. Other substances might be mixed in, herbs that made the girls more compliant, powders that dulled their awareness of what was happening to them. The ritual itself became a method of control, a way to drug victims while maintaining the pretense of cultural sophistication. The account books revealed another chilling truth. The houses tracked which girls were likely to become pregnant and took steps to prevent it, or to handle it discreetly when prevention failed. A pregnant geisha was worthless to clients, and the cost of dealing with unwanted pregnancies through herbs, crude procedures, or other means was always added to the girl's debt. As Yukiko learned to navigate this world, she began to understand the language of debts and ledgers. She saw how the numbers were manipulated, how freedom was always just out of reach, how the beautiful ceremonies masked ugly truths. But she also began to notice something else, the way information flowed through the houses like water, how secrets were traded like currency, and how knowledge could be its own form of power. What she didn't yet realize was that in the hidden auction rooms beneath the most prestigious Okorsia houses, virginity wasn't the only thing being sold to the highest bidder. The architecture of the Hanamachi districts wasn't designed for beauty, it was designed for control. Every corridor, every room, every seemingly decorative screen served a purpose in a system of surveillance that would have impressed the most paranoid emperor. The paper walls that looked so delicate and artistic were actually positioned to carry sound, ensuring that no conversation, no cry, no whispered plan for escape could remain private. Yukiko learned this lesson on her 7th day in the Willow House. She had been practicing shamisen in what she thought was a private room when the Okasan appeared beside her, like a ghost, having heard every off-key note through the carefully positioned screens. But it wasn't the musical mistakes that interested the older woman. It was the soft conversation Yukiko had been having with another girl about their families, their fears, their growing understanding of what this place really was. "The walls have ears," the Okasan said simply, running her finger along the paper screen. "And eyes. And memory. Remember this, child. Privacy is a luxury you can no longer afford." The traditional Japanese architecture that tourists admired so much served darker purposes within the geisha houses. The raised floors weren't just for removing shoes, they created hollow spaces where people could move unseen and unheard. The multiple levels and sliding panels allowed for quick escapes when authorities came asking uncomfortable questions, and for clients to be shuttled in and out without seeing each other. Each okiya was designed like a maze, with corridors that led nowhere, and rooms that served multiple purposes, depending on the time of day. What appeared to be a tea ceremony room in the afternoon might become something very different after dark. The beautiful gardens weren't just for contemplation, they provided sound cover for activities that needed to remain hidden from neighbors and passing police. The daily routine of a Maiko was scheduled with military precision, every moment accounted for, every activity monitored. Yukiko's day began at 5 in the morning, with exercises designed to maintain the unnatural posture expected of geishas: back straight, steps small, head tilted at precisely the right angle to appear submissive yet alluring. Her natural way of moving, developed over 16 years of normal life, had to be completely erased and rebuilt. The makeup ritual took 2 hours and required absolute stillness. The white powder wasn't just cosmetic, it served to erase individuality, making all the girls look similar enough that clients could project their fantasies onto any face. The red lips were painted smaller than natural lip lines, creating a childlike appearance that some men found irresistible. The black liner around the eyes was applied in patterns that differed by house, marking the girls as property of specific establishments. Between makeup and lessons, Yukiko learned that her body was no longer her own in any sense. The way she walked, the way she held her hands, even the way she breathed was subject to correction. The kimono itself was a form of control, so elaborate and expensive that running away while wearing it was impossible, so restrictive that quick movements were difficult. The shamisen lessons revealed another layer of the system's sophistication. The songs weren't chosen for their artistic merit, but for their effect on clients. Certain melodies were known to evoke nostalgia, others to create romantic moods, still others to mask sounds coming from private rooms. The girls learned to read their audience and adjust their performance accordingly, becoming psychological manipulators disguised as artists. But the most chilling aspect of the daily routine was the inspection. Every morning, the Okasan and her assistants examined each girl thoroughly, checking for signs of illness, pregnancy, or self-harm. Any marks on the skin had to be explained. Any change in behavior was noted. The girls learned to hide bruises, to smile through pain, to maintain perfect composure, even when their world was collapsing around them. The bathing facilities were communal, ostensibly for efficiency, but actually for surveillance. Girls couldn't hide physical evidence of client brutality when they had no privacy. The shared sleeping quarters served the same purpose. Escape plans couldn't be hatched when you were never alone, and suicide attempts were difficult when someone was always watching. Within this controlled environment, the girls developed their own subtle forms of communication. A certain way of folding a kimono sleeve could indicate danger. The position of hair ornaments carried messages. Even the arrangement of teacups could convey warnings or requests for help. They created a shadow language that existed beneath the official protocols, a way to maintain some small measure of human connection in a system designed to isolate them. The most disturbing discovery came when Yukiko found the hidden rooms. Behind false walls and beneath removable floor panels were spaces that didn't appear on any architectural plans. Some contained supplies for medical procedures that weren't discussed in polite society. Others held restraints and devices whose purpose became clear only when screams echoed through the building at night. These rooms revealed the true nature of the geisha houses. They weren't schools for traditional arts or even high-class brothels. They were sophisticated operations for breaking human spirits and rebuilding them according to client specifications. The training wasn't education. It was psychological conditioning designed to create perfect victims who would never resist, never complain, never seek help. As winter deepened and Yukiko's training progressed, she began to understand that the beautiful traditions, the artistic skills, and the refined ceremonies were all elaborate set dressing for something much more sinister. The real product being sold wasn't entertainment or companionship. It was absolute power over another human being. But what she couldn't yet see was the network of corruption that extended far beyond the district walls, reaching into government offices, police headquarters, and the homes of the most respectable families in Japan. In a world where speaking the truth could mean death, the geishas developed a language that existed in gestures, colors, and seemingly innocent objects. The fan wasn't just an accessory, it was a communication device more sophisticated than any telegraph. The way a geisha held it, moved it, closed it could convey messages that meant the difference between survival and disaster. Misaki learned the fan language during her 3rd month at the Pine Blossom House. The old geisha who taught her had scars on her wrists, thin white lines that spoke of a failed escape attempt years earlier. "Your fan is your voice when you have no voice," she whispered during a lesson, demonstrating how a quick flutter near the heart meant danger approaching, while a slow wave across the face meant "help me." The flower arrangements weren't random displays of seasonal beauty. Each bloom, each placement, each combination carried coded meaning that only the initiated could read. Chrysanthemums meant death was near. Camellias indicated a client had become violent. Cherry blossoms, seemingly innocent symbols of Japan itself, warned that government officials were asking questions about the house. These codes had evolved over generations, passed down from older geishas to younger ones in hushed conversations between clients. They weren't written down anywhere, the knowledge lived only in memory, making it impossible for the Okasan or clients to intercept. A girl might spend months learning the basic symbols, years mastering the subtle variations that could mean life or death. The kimono patterns carried their own intelligence network. Certain combinations of colors and designs indicated which clients were dangerous, which officials could be bribed, which houses were under surveillance. A geisha walking through the district might seem to be displaying her artistic taste, but other women could read her clothing like a newspaper filled with vital information. But the most sophisticated communication happened through the tea ceremony itself. The positioning of cups, the order of serving, the timing of each movement, all carried messages that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation. A client might think he was enjoying a traditional cultural experience, while the geishas around him were coordinating their safety using rituals he couldn't begin to understand. The intelligence network that emerged from this coded communication system rivaled anything operated by government spies. Information flowed through the districts faster than official news, and often proved more accurate. The geishas knew about political scandals before the newspapers, understood military movements before they were announced, and could predict economic changes before they affected the markets. This knowledge became its own form of currency. Wealthy clients didn't just pay for physical pleasures, they paid for information that could make or break business deals, political careers, and military campaigns. The geishas became unwilling intelligence assets, their beauty masking networks of espionage that extended into the highest levels of society. Sometimes the coded messages carried stories too terrible for words. The way a girl arranged her hair could indicate she had been sold to a particularly brutal client. The flowers she chose for her room might reveal that she was planning suicide. The pattern of her fan movements could be a desperate plea for someone to remember her name when she was gone. The Okasan and their enforcers tried to break these communication networks, but they were too organic, too deeply embedded in the culture of survival. Punishing girls for using fans or choosing certain flowers would have been like punishing them for breathing. The codes adapted, evolved, and grew more sophisticated with each attempt to suppress them. During the Festival of Lights in 1893, the coded communications revealed something that terrified even the most experienced geishas. Word spread through fan movements and flower arrangements that several girls from different houses had received the same coded warning. A client was coming who collected more than just feminine company. He collected lives. The message had originated from the River House, where a girl named Haruko had disappeared after serving tea to a foreign businessman. Her kimono was found folded neatly in her room, but she was never seen again. The fan signals that followed told a story of systematic hunting, of a predator who moved between houses like a ghost, selecting victims according to criteria only he understood. The coded warnings spread through the district like ripples in water. Girls began using more complex signals, layering meanings within meanings. A certain way of holding a shamisen, meant avoid the tall foreigner with the silver watch. A particular arrangement of incense burners warned. He asks about girls who can speak English. The positioning of makeup brushes conveyed he pays extra for girls who remind him of his dead daughter. But the most chilling message came through the most traditional medium of all. The ancient art of origami. Paper cranes began appearing in the private rooms of the most vulnerable girls. Each one folded with slightly different variations that carried specific warnings. The variations were so subtle that only another geisha would recognize them as messages rather than decoration. What the girls didn't know was that their coded communications had attracted attention from sources far more dangerous than brutal clients or corrupt Okusan. Government officials had begun to suspect that the geisha districts harbored intelligence networks that could threaten national security. Military officers wondered if foreign spies were using the traditional arts as cover for espionage activities. The beautiful language of fans and flowers was about to become evidence in investigations that would expose secrets much larger than individual survival. The very codes that had protected the geishas were about to drag them into conspiracies that stretched from the emperor's palace to the battlefields of a war that hadn't yet begun. And in the shadows of the most exclusive tea houses, someone was collecting those origami cranes and decoding messages that were never meant for his eyes. Baron Kensuke Matsudaira owned steel mills, shipping companies, and half the politicians in Tokyo. But what he truly coveted couldn't be bought with money or influence. It required the kind of possession that could only be achieved through absolute control over another human soul. When he first saw Akemi dancing in the Golden Pavilion tea house, he knew he had found what he had been searching for his entire life. The Dana system appeared respectable on the surface. Wealthy patrons supporting traditional arts by sponsoring individual geishas. The arrangement was presented as a form of patronage, like a Renaissance prince supporting a talented artist. The reality was a form of ownership that made slavery look humane by comparison. Matsudaira paid Akemi's debt to the Okiya, a sum so large it caused whispers throughout the financial district. But payment of the debt didn't mean freedom. It meant transfer of ownership. Akemi moved from the communal control of the house to the private prison of one man's obsession. She discovered that being owned by many was sometimes preferable to being owned by one. The Baron installed her in a house on the outskirts of Kyoto, surrounded by gardens that were beautiful and walls that were high. She had servants, expensive kimonos, and access to books and music that most geishas never experienced. But she also had something else. A patron whose love had curdled into possession so complete that he monitored every breath she took. Matsudaira visited 3 times a week, always arriving at exactly the same time, always following the same ritual. Akemi would perform the tea ceremony with perfect precision, play shamisen until her fingers bled, and submit to his increasingly strange demands, with the compliance that had been beaten into her during years of training. But compliance wasn't enough for the Baron. He wanted something deeper. He wanted her to love him genuinely, and her inability to manufacture real emotion drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The psychological manipulation began subtly. Gifts that came with conditions, freedoms that were granted and withdrawn, based on her performance of affection. Servants who reported her every word and expression back to their true master. Akemi learned to live under surveillance so complete that privacy became a forgotten concept. When Matsudaira discovered that Akemi kept a diary, he didn't simply confiscate it. He read every entry aloud to her, analyzing each word for evidence of disloyalty or insufficient gratitude. When he found passages expressing homesickness for her village, he hired investigators to discover her family's current situation and used their welfare as leverage to control her behavior. The Baron's obsession deepened as months passed. He commissioned artists to paint Akemi in various poses, photographers to capture her image from every angle, sculptors to create statues that would preserve her beauty forever. But no artistic representation satisfied him because none captured what he truly wanted: complete possession of her inner self. The turning point came when Akemi mentioned another patron she had known at the Okiya, a kind man who had treated her with gentleness. Matsudaira's reaction was swift and terrible. Within a week, the man's business failed under mysterious circumstances. His family faced financial ruin, and he died in what authorities ruled an accident, but witnesses described as something far more sinister. Akemi understood the message. Any connection to her past, any memory of kindness from another source, was a threat to the Baron's control. She learned to edit her memories, to speak only of experiences that centered around him, to perform gratitude and love so convincingly that sometimes she almost believed it herself. But Matsudaira's possessiveness extended beyond psychological control. He began modifying the house, adding hidden passages that allowed him to observe her without being seen. He installed mirrors positioned to capture her reflection from every angle, creating a panopticon where privacy was impossible, even in the most intimate moments. The servants weren't immune to the Baron's paranoia. He fired staff members for imagined infractions, a maid who smiled too warmly at Akemi, a gardener who lingered too long near her window. He replaced them with individuals whose loyalty had been purchased through blackmail or whose desperation made them willing to participate in increasingly disturbing surveillance. When winter came, Matsudaira announced that he was taking Akemi to his private estate in the mountains. The isolation was complete. No neighbors, no visitors, no possibility of outside contact. The estate had been designed as a fortress of solitude, where his possession of her could be absolute. What happened there during the long months of snow and silence was witnessed only by servants too terrified to speak. Spring brought news that shocked Kyoto's elite circles. The estate had burned in a mysterious fire that claimed several lives. Baron Matsudaira was found dead in his study, apparently from smoke inhalation. But the investigation revealed troubling details: doors that had been locked from the outside, evidence of accelerants, and a safe that had been emptied of important documents. Akemi survived the fire, but something in her had been extinguished forever. She returned to Kyoto a broken woman who spoke in whispers and jumped at shadows. The official story was that she had been traumatized by the tragic loss of her generous patron. The truth was that she had finally escaped a form of imprisonment so complete that death had seemed like the only option. But the Baron's influence didn't die with him. The investigation into the fire was quietly closed when certain documents disappeared from police files. Key witnesses changed their stories or suddenly left the city. The estate was rebuilt and sold to another wealthy family who were told nothing about its history. What investigators never discovered was the room beneath the estate's main building, a space that contained journals, photographs, and other evidence of obsessions that extended far beyond one geisha. Matsudaira had been part of a network of wealthy men who shared information about acquisition, control, and disposal of human property. The fire had been set to destroy evidence of crimes that would have scandalized the entire nation. And in the ashes of that evidence lay proof that the Dana system was just the public face of something much darker, a shadow economy where human beings were traded like commodities among men whose wealth and power placed them beyond the reach of law or conscience. The baby's cry pierced the pre-dawn silence of the chrysanthemum house, but within minutes the sound was gone. By sunrise, there was no evidence that a child had ever been born within those walls. The midwife cleaned her instruments, the bloodied sheets disappeared into the furnace, and the mother, barely 17 herself, was given herbs to stop her milk and told to prepare for clients who would arrive that evening. This was the reality that no guidebook mentioned, no cultural exhibition acknowledged, no romanticized story ever told. The geisha districts generated a steady stream of unwanted pregnancies, and the system had developed efficient methods for handling what it considered a costly inconvenience. Chiyo learned about the fate of these children during her second year at the House of the Golden Moon. She had been awakened by sounds she couldn't identify. A woman's muffled screams, hurried footsteps, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when anyone approached. The next morning, one of the older geishas looked different, pale, hollow-eyed, moving carefully as if something inside her had been torn. The woman never spoke about what had happened, but Chiyo began to notice patterns. Girls who had been popular with certain clients would suddenly become ill and unavailable for several days. Sometimes they returned to work unusually thin and emotionally distant. Sometimes they never returned at all, their names erased from the house records, as if they had never existed. The lucky children, if any child born into this world could be called lucky, were adopted by families who asked no questions about their origins. These arrangements were handled by networks that operated in the shadows between respectability and crime. Wealthy couples who couldn't have children of their own might pay substantial sums for healthy infants. No questions asked about the mothers, but adoption was expensive, and the geisha houses operated on profit margins that didn't accommodate charity. More often, the children disappeared through methods that weren't discussed in polite society. The floating world had always been ruthless about cutting away anything that threatened its profitability, and unwanted children represented a particularly expensive liability. Some babies were left at temples or orphanages, abandoned in baskets with no identification. These institutions, overwhelmed and underfunded, could provide only basic survival. Many of these children died from neglect or disease before their first birthday. Those who survived grew up knowing nothing about their origins, their heritage erased as completely as if they had never been born. The most haunting cases were the children who lived but remained hidden within the system. In the depths of some Okia houses were small rooms where toddlers and young children lived like ghosts, cared for by servants who were paid to keep them invisible. These children grew up in a twilight existence, neither acknowledged nor abandoned, fed on scraps and raised in silence. Taro was one of these hidden children. Born to a geisha who had been too valuable to dispose of, he spent the first 7 years of his life in a windowless room beneath the House of the Evening Star. He learned to be absolutely quiet during business hours, to make no sound that might disturb the illusion of refined entertainment happening above his head. His mother visited him when she could, stolen moments between clients when she would slip into his hiding place, and hold him with desperate intensity. She taught him to read using books stolen from clients, whispered stories about a world beyond the walls he had never seen, and promised him that someday they would escape together to a place where children could play in sunlight. That someday never came. When Taro was 8, his mother's patron discovered her secret and demanded that the inconvenience be resolved permanently. She was given a choice: her child or her life. She chose her child's life and paid for that choice with her own. Found hanging in her room the next morning, with a note that blamed gambling debts for her despair. Taro was smuggled out of the house that same night, sold to a factory owner who needed cheap labor, and asked no questions about the thin boy with the haunted eyes. He would spend the next decade in industrial servitude that was brutal, but at least acknowledged his existence. Sometimes in his darkest moments, he wondered if the windowless room had been preferable. The system produced thousands of such stories. Children who grew up never knowing their mothers' names. Mothers who carried the weight of abandoned babies for the rest of their lives. Families torn apart by an economy that treated human reproduction as a business problem to be solved efficiently. Some of the abandoned children were eventually reunited with family members through networks of activists and sympathetic officials. These reunions were often devastating. Mothers who had been told their children were dead discovering them alive but damaged. Children learning the truth about parents they had been taught to hate or forget. The psychological damage rippled through generations. Women who had been forced to abandon children became unable to form healthy relationships with anyone. Children who grew up in the shadows developed personality disorders, attachment issues, and a fundamental distrust of human connection that therapy couldn't heal. The geisha districts created a hidden population of people whose very existence challenged the narrative of cultural refinement and artistic tradition. These were the invisible victims of a system that maintained its beautiful facade by disposing of anything that might crack the illusion. In modern Japan, some of these children, now elderly, have begun to speak about their experiences. They describe childhoods spent in attics and basements, mothers who loved them but couldn't acknowledge them, and a society that preferred to pretend they didn't exist, rather than confront the ugly realities behind cultural myths. Their testimonies reveal that the floating world's cruelty extended beyond the women who served in it to the children who were born from it. The beautiful traditions, the refined arts, and the romantic stories all rested on a foundation of discarded lives and buried secrets. What remains hidden even today are the records that would reveal how many children disappeared, how many mothers died from botched procedures, and how many families were destroyed by a system that prioritized profit over human life. Those records, if they ever existed, have been buried as deeply as the children themselves. And in the quiet corners of Japan's cities, elderly people still live with memories of mothers they barely knew and childhoods spent hiding from a world that would have preferred they never existed at all. The black ships of Commodore Perry had forced Japan's doors open to the world, but it was the geisha districts that taught the country how to profit from foreign fascination. As the Meiji Restoration transformed Japan from feudal isolation to modern nation, the floating world evolved into something unprecedented, a laboratory where ancient traditions merged with modern manipulation to create new forms of power. Emperor Meiji's government faced an impossible challenge: how to modernize rapidly while maintaining cultural identity, how to appear civilized to Western eyes while preserving Japanese essence. The geisha districts provided an unexpected solution. Foreign diplomats and businessmen who might have dismissed Japan as backward were enchanted by the mysterious world of silk screens and shamisen music. What they saw as exotic cultural experience was actually sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to extract maximum advantage from their fascination. The transformation began in the 1870s, when the first Western hotels opened in Tokyo and Kyoto. Foreign guests expressed interest in experiencing authentic Japanese culture, and enterprising Okiya owners quickly recognized a lucrative opportunity. They began offering carefully choreographed geisha performances that bore little resemblance to traditional practices, but gave Westerners exactly what they expected from their preconceptions about mysterious Oriental femininity. These performances were cultural theater designed for foreign consumption. The tea ceremonies were simplified and romanticized, stripped of religious significance, but enhanced with visual elements that photographed well. The dances were modified to emphasize movements that Western audiences found graceful or erotic. Even the conversation was scripted, with geishas trained to say exactly what would reinforce foreign stereotypes about submissive, artistic Japanese women. But the real innovation wasn't in the performances, it was in the intelligence gathering. Foreign businessmen, relaxed by alcohol, and mesmerized by exotic beauty, revealed industrial secrets, military information, and political plans that Japanese officials could never have obtained through conventional diplomacy. The geisha districts became unofficial intelligence operations disguised as cultural experiences. The government began to understand the strategic value of this accidental espionage network. Subtle support flowed to Okiya houses that proved particularly effective at extracting information from foreign guests. Certain geishas received special training in conversation techniques, designed to encourage men to reveal more than they intended. The ancient arts became weapons in a new kind of warfare, economic and political, rather than military. The most successful practitioners of this cultural espionage weren't necessarily the most beautiful or artistic geishas, but those with the sharpest minds and the best understanding of foreign psychology. They learned to speak fragments of English, French, and German just enough to make their clients feel sophisticated and understood. They studied Western customs and references, allowing them to engage in conversations that seemed naturally flowing but were actually carefully guided interrogations. Keiko of the Maple Leaf House became legendary for her ability to extract business secrets from American traders. She would appear charmingly confused by Western business practices, asking innocent questions that encouraged men to explain their strategies in detail. Her apparent naivete masked a brilliant analytical mind that could identify valuable information and remember complex details perfectly. The intelligence she gathered helped Japanese manufacturers understand foreign production methods, pricing strategies, and market weaknesses. The transformation created a new class of geisha women who were essentially unofficial diplomatic agents disguised as traditional entertainers. They attended embassy receptions, private business dinners, and informal gatherings where policy was shaped and deals were made. Their presence was considered appropriate because they appeared to be decorative rather than functional, beautiful accessories rather than active participants. This evolution coincided with Japan's rapid modernization in other areas. Railways connected the major cities, telegraph lines enabled instant communication, and new industries emerged almost overnight. The geisha districts adapted to these changes by becoming more sophisticated in their operations and more strategic in their objectives. The international reputation of Japanese geishas grew during this period, but the image that spread globally was carefully constructed rather than authentically traditional. Western writers, artists, and travelers returned home with stories of mysterious artistic women who embodied the exotic appeal of the Orient. These romanticized accounts, published in books and magazines, created a mythology that bore little resemblance to the reality of the districts, but served Japan's interests perfectly. The mythology attracted more foreign visitors, more business opportunities, and more chances to gather valuable intelligence. It also provided cultural cover for activities that might otherwise have attracted scrutiny. Foreign governments that might have been suspicious of Japanese spies were charmed by the idea of artistic geishas who seemed completely removed from political or military concerns. By the 1890s, the geisha districts had evolved into sophisticated operations that combined cultural performance, economic intelligence, and social manipulation. They were no longer simply entertainment venues, but strategic assets in Japan's efforts to compete with Western powers while maintaining the appearance of cultural authenticity. But this transformation came at a cost. The traditional arts that had given the districts their original character were increasingly modified for foreign consumption. Younger geishas learned performance skills designed to appeal to Western tastes rather than to preserve Japanese cultural heritage. The authentic traditions began to fade, replaced by manufactured exoticism that was more profitable but less genuine. The psychological toll on the women involved was enormous. They were required to be cultural ambassadors, intelligence agents, and traditional entertainers, simultaneously. The emotional labor of maintaining these multiple identities while serving clients who saw them as exotic objects, rather than human beings, created psychological fractures that would never fully heal. As the 19th century drew to a close, the geisha districts had successfully transformed from feudal entertainment venues into modernized operations that served Japan's strategic interests. But the women who made this transformation possible were about to face challenges that would test their survival skills in ways that centuries of tradition had never prepared them for. The world was changing rapidly, and the floating world was about to discover that its carefully constructed illusions couldn't protect it from the harsh realities of international conflict and social upheaval that lay ahead. The air raid sirens began wailing over Kyoto at 2:47 a.m. on a night in March 1945. But inside the Phoenix House, Okiya, a different kind of destruction had already begun. The beautiful silk kimonos that had once commanded princely sons were being cut into strips for bandages. The shamisen music that had charmed wealthy patrons was replaced by the sound of women whispering prayers for sons and brothers who would never return from battlefields across the Pacific. War transformed the geisha districts more completely than centuries of cultural evolution. The floating world that had adapted to the Meiji Restoration, survived economic upheavals, and evolved to serve foreign interests, suddenly faced an enemy that could destroy it entirely. Total national mobilization that left no room for anything the government considered non-essential. The first changes came gradually. Wealthy clients disappeared, as military conscription and economic controls redirected resources toward the war effort. The elaborate tea ceremonies became impossible when tea became a rationed commodity more precious than gold. The silk trade collapsed when materials were needed for parachutes and uniforms instead of beautiful kimonos. By 1943, most Okiya houses had closed or transformed into something unrecognizable. The buildings became munitions factories, where women who had once poured tea now assembled artillery shells. The careful makeup and hair arrangements that had defined geisha identity were replaced by factory caps and work clothes. The artistic traditions that had survived for centuries were abandoned in favor of patriotic songs that praised the emperor and encouraged sacrifice for the war effort. But some geishas found roles that utilized skills they had developed during decades of serving powerful men. Their ability to please, to listen, to extract information, and to manage complex social situations made them valuable in ways the military hadn't anticipated. The same talents that had been used to entertain merchants and diplomats could be redirected towards serving soldiers and supporting the war effort. Masako had been one of the most celebrated geishas in the Golden District before the war began. When Hirokiya closed in 1944, she was recruited for special service that took advantage of her linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge. She was assigned to work with American prisoners of war, using her understanding of foreign psychology to extract military intelligence. The work was presented as patriotic duty, but Masako quickly understood that she was being asked to use techniques of psychological manipulation that went far beyond anything she had learned in the entertainment districts. The prisoners were hungry, frightened, and desperate for human kindness. Her job was to provide that kindness while carefully probing for information about American military capabilities, plans, and morale. The ethical compromises required by this work were devastating. Masako had spent her career learning to please men while protecting her own psychological core. But interrogating prisoners required her to weaponize human connection in ways that violated everything she understood about dignity and honor. She began drinking heavily to numb the shame of manipulating men who were already suffering. Other geishas found themselves conscripted into roles that were even more morally ambiguous. The comfort women system that the Japanese military established in occupied territory sometimes recruited from the entertainment districts, taking women who had already been trained to serve male desires and forcing them into military brothels that served Japanese soldiers. These women discovered that their years of training in submission and compliance had prepared them for a form of service that was horrifying in its systematization. The psychological techniques they had learned for managing difficult clients became survival mechanisms in situations where resistance could mean death. The home front created its own forms of exploitation. Geishas who remained in Japan were sometimes assigned to provide morale support for workers in critical industries. The euphemism covered activities that ranged from serving tea in factory canteens to providing more intimate services for men whose productivity was considered essential to the war effort. The beautiful traditions that had once masked commercial sexual transactions were stripped away entirely during wartime. The cultural refinements, artistic pretensions, and social rituals that had provided some dignity and meaning to the women's lives were discarded as unnecessary luxuries. What remained was raw exploitation justified by patriotic duty rather than cultural tradition. Some geishas found ways to resist or subvert their assigned roles. A few used their positions to help prisoners of war, passing along information or providing assistance that violated their orders. Others found ways to sabotage the intelligence-gathering efforts they were supposed to support, giving false information or warning subjects about interrogation techniques. But resistance was dangerous and rare. The military authorities who controlled the districts during wartime had none of the cultural sensibilities that had once provided some protection for the women. Suspected disloyalty was punished swiftly and brutally, often by methods that made the Okiya discipline system seem gentle by comparison. The bombing campaigns that devastated Japanese cities in 1945 destroyed many of the physical structures that had housed the geisha districts for centuries. But the bombs couldn't destroy the memories, trauma, and psychological damage that the war had inflicted on the women who had served in various capacities throughout the conflict. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the surviving geishas faced a country in ruins and a culture that had been fundamentally altered. The floating world they had once known was gone forever, replaced by military occupation, social upheaval, and economic devastation that would take decades to repair. But liberation from war didn't mean freedom from exploitation. As American occupation forces established control over Japan, the geisha districts would face new challenges and new forms of cultural misunderstanding that would reshape their identity once again. The women who had survived the war carried with them secrets about collaboration and resistance, about moral compromises and acts of courage that would remain largely unspoken for decades. The floating world had always been built on silence and secrecy, but the wartime experiences created new categories of shame and trauma that were too painful to acknowledge and too important to forget. The American Jeep pulled up to the Sakura House, Okiya, on a rainy October evening in 1945, its headlights cutting through the darkness of a Kyoto still scarred by war. Staff Sergeant William Morrison had been in Japan for 6 weeks, part of the occupation force tasked with rebuilding a defeated nation. What he thought he knew about geishas came from propaganda films and Orientalist fantasies. What he was about to discover would entangle him in a web of espionage that reached from the ruins of Japanese cities to the highest levels of American intelligence. The occupation transformed the geisha districts in ways that nobody had anticipated. American soldiers, hungry for entertainment and exotic experiences, became eager customers for cultural performances that bore little resemblance to traditional practices. But beneath the surface of cross-cultural interaction, something much more sophisticated was developing. The CIA, newly formed and eager to establish intelligence networks in occupied territories, quickly recognized the value of the existing geisha system. These women had spent decades learning to extract information from powerful men while maintaining appearances of simple entertainment. Their skills were perfectly suited for Cold War espionage, and their cultural position provided ideal cover for intelligence operations. Morrison's assignment was officially listed as cultural liaison, but his real job was to identify geishas who could be recruited as intelligence assets. The recruitment process was subtle, often beginning with generous payment for traditional performances and gradually evolving into requests for information about Japanese officials, business leaders, and anyone who might pose a threat to American interests. The geishas found themselves caught between old masters and new ones, serving American interests while navigating the complex politics of occupied Japan. Some embraced the opportunity to work with the occupying forces, seeing collaboration as a path to survival in a devastated economy. Others resisted, viewing cooperation with foreign intelligence as betrayal of their country and culture. Yuki had survived the war by working in a munitions factory, but when the Americans arrived, she returned to work as a geisha serving occupation personnel. Her fluent English and understanding of American culture made her valuable to both sides: Japanese officials who wanted to understand their occupiers, and American intelligence officers who needed insights into Japanese society. The dual role required psychological balancing acts that were exhausting and morally complicated. Yuki would spend evenings entertaining American officers, laughing at their jokes, and encouraging them to share details about military operations and political plans. Days were spent meeting with Japanese contacts who wanted to know what the Americans were really thinking and planning for Japan's future. The information flowed in both directions, creating a complex web of espionage that served multiple masters simultaneously. American intelligence got insights into Japanese reconstruction efforts, resistance movements, and political developments. Japanese officials received advance warning about American policy changes, economic initiatives, and military decisions. But this double game had consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. The geisha districts became focal points for cultural misunderstanding and political manipulation that would influence American-Japanese relations for decades. The Americans saw the geishas as exotic entertainers who could be easily controlled and exploited. The Japanese saw them as cultural ambassadors who could influence foreign opinion and policy. The reality was more complex than either side understood. The geishas were neither passive victims nor willing collaborators, but sophisticated operators who had learned to survive by serving the interests of whoever held power, while protecting their own limited agency. They adapted to the occupation just as they had adapted to war, military control, and centuries of social and economic exploitation. The most closely guarded secret of the occupation period wasn't military or political, it was the extent to which American intelligence operations relied on sexual services provided by geishas and other entertainment workers. The official reports described cultural exchanges and information gathering through social interaction, but the reality involved systematic sexual exploitation disguised as intelligence work. Morrison's classified reports, declassified decades later, reveal the moral compromises that defined this period. He wrote about geishas who provided exceptional cooperation with intelligence gathering, describing their value as assets, while completely ignoring their humanity. The reports read like business assessments of useful equipment, rather than descriptions of human beings caught in impossible circumstances. The psychological toll on the women involved was enormous. They had survived a devastating war only to find themselves serving foreign masters who saw them as exotic objects rather than human beings. The cultural traditions that had once provided some meaning and dignity to their work were further eroded by the crude expectations of American soldiers who understood nothing about Japanese subtlety or refinement. Some geishas used their positions to gather intelligence about American operations, passing information to Japanese officials or resistance groups. This counter-espionage was extremely dangerous, as discovery could result in imprisonment or deportation. But for women who had spent their lives serving foreign interests while maintaining some core of personal identity, resistance became a form of psychological survival. The most disturbing aspect of the occupation period was how it institutionalized sexual exploitation under the cover of intelligence operations. The same military that was officially committed to democratizing Japan and establishing respect for human rights was simultaneously operating a system that treated Japanese women as sexual resources for both pleasure and espionage. The legacy of this period shaped American perceptions of Asian women for generations. The fantasy of submissive exotic entertainers who existed to serve male desires became embedded in American popular culture, influencing everything from Hollywood movies to military policies and subsequent Asian conflicts. When the occupation ended in 1952, many of the intelligence networks that had been established through the geisha districts remained operational. The Cold War created ongoing demand for information about Japanese politics, economics, and social developments. Some geishas continued to serve as intelligence assets for years after the occupation officially ended, their work hidden behind the facade of cultural entertainment. The classified documents that have been released reveal only fragments of the full story. Most records remained sealed, and many participants took their secrets to the grave. But enough evidence exists to understand that the occupation period created new forms of exploitation that built upon the existing structure of the geisha system, while adding layers of international espionage and cultural manipulation. The women who served as intelligence assets during this period were neither heroes nor villains, but survivors who adapted to circumstances beyond their control. Their stories remain largely untold, buried in classified files, and protected by silence that serves the interests of governments rather than historical truth. The scandal broke on a humid August morning in 1963, when police raided the Morning Glory house and discovered ledgers that revealed something far more sinister than traditional entertainment. The records documented a human trafficking operation that had been using the respected Okiya, as a front for activities that shocked even hardened investigators. But what truly stunned the authorities was the discovery that several of Japan's most respected geishas had been complicit in the operation, and that they were ready to testify about crimes that reached into the highest levels of society. The 1960s brought unprecedented social change to Japan. Economic prosperity, Western influence, and generational shifts were transforming traditional culture at breakneck speed. The geisha districts, already weakened by war and occupation, faced new challenges that threatened their very existence. Younger women had other opportunities and weren't willing to accept the restrictions and exploitation that previous generations had endured. The customer base was shifting toward modern entertainment forms that didn't require elaborate cultural training. But for the aging women who had spent their lives in the floating world, change meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the system they had served. Some chose to maintain the beautiful illusions that had sustained them through decades of difficulty. Others decided that the time had come to speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. Sachiko had entered the Moonbeam House in 1925 as a child of 8. By 1963, she was 56 years old, one of the most respected geishas in Kyoto, and completely disillusioned with the myths that surrounded her profession. The raid on the Morning Glory House gave her an opportunity she had been waiting for, a chance to expose the reality behind the romantic facade. Her testimony to investigators revealed a network of interconnected okiya houses that had been engaging in systematic human trafficking for decades. Young women were recruited from rural areas with promises of artistic training and respectable careers, but were actually being prepared for sexual servitude that extended far beyond traditional geisha services. The trafficking operation was sophisticated and well organized. Rural families facing economic hardship were targeted by recruiters who understood exactly how to exploit desperation and cultural traditions. The contracts appeared legitimate, offering training in traditional arts and placement in respected establishments. But the fine print created debt obligations that were impossible to fulfill, and conditions that amounted to slavery. What made Sachiko's testimony particularly devastating was her insider knowledge of how the system operated. She could identify specific individuals, describe particular incidents, and provide documentary evidence that corroborated her claims. Her decision to cooperate with investigators wasn't motivated by revenge or bitterness, but by a recognition that silence had protected criminals at the expense of victims for too long. The investigation revealed connections between the trafficking networks and prominent business leaders, political figures, and law enforcement officials. The same men who publicly praised traditional Japanese culture as a source of national pride were privately exploiting that culture to justify criminal behavior. The respect accorded to geishas as cultural ambassadors had provided perfect cover for activities that violated every principle they claimed to represent. Other geishas began to come forward with their own stories. Keiko testified about clients who had purchased exclusive access to teenage girls, paying premiums for virginity and youth. Mariko described a system of punishment and control that included physical violence, drug addiction, and psychological manipulation designed to break resistant spirits. The testimonies painted a picture of systematic abuse that extended far beyond individual cases of mistreatment. The trafficking networks had operated with impunity because they were protected by cultural traditions that discouraged victims from speaking out, and by corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. The bravery required for these women to testify cannot be overstated. They faced social ostracism, economic retaliation, and physical threats from individuals who had profited from the criminal activities they were exposing. Many had spent their entire adult lives in a system that punished any form of defiance or independence. Speaking publicly about their experiences violated every rule they had been taught about survival. The investigation also revealed the international dimensions of the trafficking networks. Foreign businessmen and diplomats had been regular customers for specialized services that went far beyond traditional geisha entertainment. Some had participated in activities that would have been considered criminal in their home countries, but were protected by diplomatic immunity and cultural confusion about the nature of geisha services. The most heartbreaking testimonies came from women who described the children they had been forced to abandon, the friends who had disappeared without explanation, and the psychological damage they had suffered from years of exploitation. These stories revealed the human cost of a system that had been romanticized by popular culture, while destroying the lives of the women who served within it. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the cultural and political sensitivities surrounding the geisha tradition. Prosecutors had to distinguish between legitimate cultural practices and criminal exploitation, while defense attorneys argued that their clients were simply participating in time-honored traditions. The distinction was often unclear, as the criminal activities had been deeply embedded within cultural institutions that were widely respected. Some of the most powerful figures implicated in the investigation were never prosecuted. Key witnesses died under suspicious circumstances or suddenly recanted their testimony. Evidence disappeared from police files, and investigations were quietly closed without explanation. The same corruption that had protected the trafficking networks continued to shield the most prominent perpetrators from accountability, but the damage to the Geisha system's reputation was irreversible. The testimonies had exposed the reality behind the cultural mythology, making it impossible for the public to maintain romantic illusions about the floating world. The combination of changing social attitudes, economic transformation, and criminal revelations effectively ended the traditional geisha system as it had existed for centuries. The women who had testified faced uncertain futures. Some remained in Kyoto, trying to rebuild their lives, while dealing with the stigma of having broken the code of silence. Others left Japan entirely, seeking anonymity in foreign countries where their past wouldn't follow them. A few continued working as geishas, serving clients who were attracted by notoriety rather than traditional cultural appreciation. The investigation of 1963 marked the end of an era, but it also represented a form of justice for women who had been denied agency and voice for their entire lives. Their courage in speaking truth to power had broken a cycle of exploitation that had lasted for centuries, even though the personal cost of that courage was enormous. The powerful men whose names were never revealed in the official reports continued to live comfortably, their reputations protected by silence and corruption. But the women who had served them had finally found their voices, and their testimonies would become part of a historical record that could never be completely erased. The tour bus pulled up to the restored Gion district on a bright spring morning in 2019, disgorging 42 tourists eager to experience authentic traditional Japan. Their guide, a young woman in a kimono purchased from a costume shop, began her rehearsed presentation about the elegant world of geishas, their refined arts, and their important role in preserving Japanese culture. What she didn't mention, what no official tour ever mentions, is that they were walking through a carefully sanitized museum built on unmarked graves. The modern geisha districts exist as cultural Disneyland, preserved and promoted by tourism boards that have completely divorced the contemporary experience from historical reality. The buildings have been restored to an idealized version of traditional architecture that never actually existed. The performances are choreographed for foreign audiences who want to see their preconceptions confirmed rather than challenged. The stories told are myths designed to sell hotel rooms and restaurant meals rather than preserve authentic history. But beneath the polished surfaces and manufactured authenticity, the ghosts of the floating world refuse to rest quietly. The psychological legacy of centuries of exploitation haunts the modern districts in ways that go far beyond folklore and tourist superstitions. Dr. Kenji Tanaka began his research into intergenerational trauma in Japan's entertainment districts in 2005. Initially focusing on the descendants of former geishas, what he discovered was a pattern of inherited psychological damage that manifested in depression, anxiety disorders, relationship difficulties, and self-destructive behaviors that couldn't be explained by individual life experiences alone. The families he interviewed described recurring patterns that seemed to pass from mother to daughter, like genetic inheritances. Women who had never worked in entertainment, but whose grandmothers had been geishas, showed remarkably similar symptoms. Difficulty trusting intimate partners, perfectionist tendencies that masked deep shame, and a persistent sense that their value as human beings depended on their ability to please others. These psychological patterns weren't random or coincidental. They were the predictable result of trauma that had been systematically inflicted, and then systematically silenced. The women who had survived the geisha system had passed their coping mechanisms, fears and emotional wounds to their children, who passed them to their children, creating generations of people who carried pain they couldn't fully understand or articulate. The modern geisha industry, such as it exists, employs perhaps a few hundred women across all of Japan. These contemporary practitioners face the impossible task of representing a traditional culture that has been so thoroughly mythologized that authentic practice is nearly impossible. They must perform roles that satisfy tourist expectations while maintaining some connection to historical practices that were themselves often performances rather than genuine cultural expressions. Michiko became a geisha in 2015, drawn by what she thought was an opportunity to engage with traditional Japanese arts. The reality proved to be far more complicated. Her training focused primarily on entertainment techniques designed for foreign audiences, rather than traditional skills. Her clients were mostly international businessmen who wanted exotic dinner companions, rather than cultural education. The artistic traditions she had hoped to learn was secondary to her ability to fulfill stereotypical expectations about submissive, mysterious Asian femininity. The psychological pressure of constantly performing an artificial identity while representing a romanticized tradition proved overwhelming. Michiko began experiencing panic attacks, insomnia, and a persistent sense of disconnection from her authentic self. She was living the same psychological fragmentation that had afflicted geishas for centuries, but without the cultural context that had once provided some meaning to the sacrifice. The tourism industry that profits from geisha mythology has no interest in acknowledging the historical reality behind the beautiful facades. Hotel brochures promise encounters with living cultural treasures, while carefully avoiding any mention of the exploitation, violence, and systematic dehumanization that defined the traditional system. The sanitized version generates more revenue and causes fewer uncomfortable questions. This selective memory extends to academic and cultural institutions that should know better. Museums display beautiful kimonos and artistic implements, while omitting any discussion of how these objects were used within systems of human trafficking and sexual slavery. Cultural centers offer classes in traditional arts without acknowledging that these same arts were once taught to children who had been sold into bondage. The physical spaces of the modern districts carry their own haunted history. Buildings that once housed ukiyo operations have been converted into restaurants, hotels, and cultural centers, but their architectural features still reflect their original purposes. Hidden passages designed for discreet client access remain behind modern renovations. Small rooms that once confined unwilling children are now used for storage or staff areas. Local residents report persistent problems that have no rational explanation. Strange sounds echo through buildings at night. Crying, whispering, footsteps in empty corridors. Electronic equipment malfunctions in patterns that seem almost intentional. Visitors describe feelings of sadness or anxiety that overtake them in certain locations, emotions that seem to emanate from the spaces themselves rather than from personal experiences. Whether these phenomena represent actual supernatural manifestations or psychological responses to traumatic history is less important than what they represent: the persistence of unprocessed grief and unacknowledged injustice. The beautiful surfaces of the modern districts cannot erase the memory of what happened within their walls. The Buddhist temples that serve the geisha districts have quietly acknowledged this spiritual dimension. Priests report unusual numbers of prayer requests for the spirits of women who died in the entertainment areas, particularly requests from people who have no direct connection to the history but feel compelled to pray for souls they believe cannot rest. These prayers reflect a collective unconscious recognition that the sins of the floating world have never been properly acknowledged or atoned for. The cultural amnesia that allows modern Japan to celebrate geisha tradition while ignoring geisha reality creates a spiritual debt that cannot be resolved through tourism revenue or cultural preservation. The most disturbing aspect of the modern districts is how they perpetuate the same objectification and cultural appropriation that defined the historical system. Foreign visitors dress up in rental kimonos to take photographs that reduce complex cultural traditions to costume play. They attend performances that reinforce stereotypes about Asian femininity while contributing nothing to understanding the real experiences of the women who created these traditions. This commodification of trauma represents a continuation of the exploitation that defined the original geisha system. The women who suffered and died in these districts are reduced to marketing materials for experiences that deny their humanity while profiting from their pain. The modern ghosts of the floating world aren't just supernatural phenomena, they're psychological, cultural, and ethical manifestations of unresolved history. They represent the voices of women who were silenced in life and remain silenced in death. Their stories sanitized away to preserve comfortable myths about beautiful traditions. Until Japanese society confronts the reality of what happened in the geisha districts, the systematic exploitation, the human trafficking, the generations of women whose lives were destroyed for male entertainment, these ghosts will continue to haunt not just the preserved buildings, but but the collective conscience of a culture that profits from forgetting its victims. In the basement archives of Kyoto's municipal building, filed under miscellaneous municipal records, and covered with decades of dust, lies a leather-bound ledger that contains 1,027 names. Each entry includes a date, an age, and a cause of death written in careful brushstrokes. What the ledger doesn't include, what it was specifically designed to omit, are the circumstances that led to so many young women dying violent deaths in a city renowned for its cultural refinement and spiritual tranquility. The ledger represents only official deaths that couldn't be completely concealed. The actual number of women who died in Kyoto's geisha districts between 1850 and 1960 was certainly much higher, but their deaths were recorded as accidents, suicides, or illnesses that took them away from the districts before they died. The system had evolved sophisticated methods for making inconvenient deaths disappear from official records. Akane's name appears in the ledger under the date March 15, 1924. Her age is listed as 19. Cause of death as accidental drowning. What the record doesn't mention is that her body was found in a pond barely 2 feet deep, that her wrists bore rope marks, or that witnesses saw her being carried from the peony house Okoya by 2 men who were never identified or questioned. The investigation into Akane's death lasted exactly 3 days before being closed due to insufficient evidence. The detective assigned to the case received a promotion shortly afterward, and was transferred to a different district. The witnesses who had initially spoken to police suddenly claimed they had been mistaken about what they saw. The Okoya where Akane had lived and worked was sold within a month, its new owners instructed to destroy any personal belongings left behind. But Akane's story didn't die with her body. Other women in the district whispered about her death, adding details that official investigators had chosen to ignore. She had been pregnant by a prominent client who couldn't afford the scandal of an illegitimate child. She had threatened to expose a trafficking network that supplied girls to foreign businessmen. She had tried to organize other geishas to demand better treatment and fair payment. The exact truth about Akane's death will never be known, but her case illustrates patterns that appear throughout the hidden records of the geisha districts. Women who became inconvenient had a tendency to die suddenly and mysteriously. The investigations were perfunctory, the conclusions predetermined, and the evidence regularly disappeared. Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto spent 15 years collecting stories about women who had vanished from the floating world without explanation. His research, published in a small academic journal that few people read, documented case after case of suspicious deaths that were never properly investigated. The patterns he identified suggested systematic elimination of witnesses, troublemakers, and anyone who threatened the profitable operations of the districts. The methods varied, but the results were consistent. Some women died from mysterious illnesses that struck suddenly and proved resistant to treatment. Others suffered fatal accidents that occurred under circumstances that defied probability. Still others committed suicide despite showing no previous signs of depression or despair, leaving behind notes that seemed written by different hands. The most chilling discovery in Yamamoto's research was evidence that some Okoya houses maintained relationships with criminal organizations that specialized in making problems disappear. These Yakuza connections provided enforcement services that went far beyond debt collection or discipline. They offered permanent solutions for women who had learned too much, seen too much, or threatened to speak about activities that needed to remain secret. The spiritual traditions of the geisha districts included elaborate rituals for honoring the dead, but these ceremonies were reserved for women who had died appropriately from old age, recognized illness, or other causes that didn't threaten the district's reputation. Women who died under suspicious circumstances were buried quietly, often in unmarked graves, without the Buddhist rites that were considered essential for spiritual peace. These unmarked graves created spiritual problems that Buddhist priests privately acknowledged, but rarely discussed publicly. According to traditional beliefs, souls that weren't properly honored in death couldn't find peace and would remain bound to the earthly realm. The geisha districts were creating populations of restless spirits whose presence would haunt the areas indefinitely. Modern spiritual practitioners who work in the preserved districts report unprecedented levels of spiritual disturbance. The usual methods for calming troubled souls, prayers, offerings, ceremonial acknowledgement, seem insufficient for addressing the spiritual chaos created by so many unrecognized deaths. Some priests describe the districts as spiritually poisoned by accumulated grief and unresolved injustice. The photographs are perhaps the most haunting evidence of lives that have been erased from official memory. In private collections and forgotten albums, images survive of women whose names don't appear in any official records. They stare out from the pictures with expressions that seem to know they won't be remembered, that their stories will die with them, that their suffering will be forgotten as soon as it becomes inconvenient to acknowledge. Some of these photographs show evidence of physical abuse that contradicts official narratives about the refined, protected world of traditional entertainment. Bruises carefully concealed by makeup, defensive postures that suggest fear, forced smiles that don't reach eyes filled with desperation. These images document a reality that written records were designed to conceal. The personal belongings that survived tell their own stories. Letters that were never sent, hidden in wall spaces, and discovered during renovations, decades later. Diary entries written in code, preserving thoughts and experiences that were too dangerous to record openly. Jewelry that was pawned to pay for escape attempts that never succeeded. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a collection of children's toys found walled up in a Nokia basement during renovation work in 1987. The toys appeared to belong to very young children, but no official records indicated that children had ever lived in the building. The implications were so disturbing that the discovery was never reported to authorities, and the toys were quietly destroyed. The international nature of some disappearances adds another layer of complexity to the hidden history. Foreign men who visited the district sometimes requested services that went beyond traditional entertainment, and some women who served these clients were never seen again. Whether they were killed, sold to overseas networks, or transported to foreign countries remains unknown. The modern descendants of Geisha families carry genetic memory of these losses even when they don't know specific details about what happened to their ancestors. DNA studies have revealed that many families associated with the entertainment districts show markers consistent with severe historical trauma, genetic signatures that persist across generations and influence everything from stress responses to mental health outcomes. The therapeutic work being done with survivors and descendants has revealed that healing requires acknowledgement of specific losses rather than general recognition of systemic problems. The unnamed dead cannot rest until their individual stories are told, their specific suffering acknowledged, and their dignity restored through honest historical accounting. But this individual recognition requires access to records that remain classified, testimony from people who have died, and acknowledgement from institutions that profit from maintaining sanitized versions of history. The unspoken names represent not just personal tragedies, but collective responsibility for creating systems that systematically erased inconvenient truths. The ledger in the Kyoto archives contains 1,047 names, but it represents thousands more women whose deaths were never officially recorded, whose names were deliberately erased, and whose stories were buried along with their bodies. They haunt the modern districts not as supernatural phenomena, but as ethical obligations that remain unfulfilled. Their silence accuses not just the individuals who profited from their exploitation, but the cultural systems that continue to romanticize their suffering, while refusing to acknowledge their humanity. The unspoken names demand recognition not for revenge, but for truth. Not for punishment, but for the basic dignity of being remembered as human beings whose lives mattered. The therapy session began like hundreds of others. Dr. Emiko Sato had conducted over 2 decades of practice. But 20 minutes into the conversation with 73-year-old Mrs. Hayashi, she realized she was hearing something unprecedented. The elderly woman was describing psychological patterns that had shaped her entire life. An inability to speak her own desires, a compulsive need to anticipate and fulfill others' needs, and a persistent sense that her value as a human being depended entirely on male approval. But she had never worked as a geisha or in any entertainment profession. Mrs. Hayashi's grandmother had been a geisha in pre-war Kyoto. Her mother had been raised in the Okiya system before escaping through marriage to a shopkeeper. Miss Hayashi herself had grown up in a conventional middle-class family, but the psychological patterns that had been forged in the floating world had been passed down like heirloom jewelry, intact and unexamined across 3 generations. The research that emerged from thousands of similar therapy sessions revealed something that historical accounts had never acknowledged. The geisha system hadn't just exploited individual women. It had created psychological templates that influenced how entire generations of Japanese women understood their roles, relationships, and sense of self-worth. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different families and regions. Women whose grandmothers or great-grandmothers had worked as geishas showed elevated rates of anxiety disorders, perfectionist tendencies, and relationship difficulties, that seemed to have no connection to their personal experiences. They described feeling responsible for managing other people's emotions, incapable of expressing anger or dissatisfaction, and convinced that their worth depended on their ability to be pleasing and undemanding. Dr. Sato's clinical observations were supported by emerging research in epigenetics, which revealed that severe trauma could create genetic changes that were passed to subsequent generations. The systematic psychological conditioning that defined the Geisha system, the erasure of personal desires, the requirement to prioritize male pleasure above personal safety, the punishment of any form of authentic self-expression, had created biological changes that influenced brain chemistry and stress responses across multiple generations. The therapeutic work required helping clients understand connections between their personal struggles and historical trauma they had never directly experienced. Women who had spent decades in therapy for depression or anxiety disorders discovered that their symptoms had roots in exploitation their grandmothers had endured half a century earlier. The most difficult aspect of this therapeutic work was helping clients recognize that their most praised characteristics, their selflessness, their ability to anticipate others' needs, their talent for avoiding conflict, were actually trauma responses that had been passed down and celebrated as feminine virtues. The qualities that made them good wives and mothers were the same psychological adaptations that had helped their ancestors survive sexual slavery. Keiko Tanaka, now 68, spent most of her adult life believing she was simply a naturally accommodating person who preferred harmony to conflict. Through therapy, she began to understand that her inability to say no, her tendency to apologize for things that weren't her fault, and her compulsive need to please everyone around her weren't personality traits but inherited survival mechanisms. Her grandmother had worked at the Chrysanthemum House from 1910 to 1935, serving clients who expected complete submission and punished any sign of independent thought or personal preference. The psychological conditioning that had kept her grandmother alive, the ability to anticipate male desires, suppress personal needs, and maintain pleasing facades regardless of internal experience, had been passed down as family values about proper feminine behavior. The intergenerational transmission wasn't just psychological, it was cultural. Families influenced by the Geisha system developed child-rearing practices that emphasized submission, accommodation, and the suppression of authentic self-expression. These practices were rationalized as traditional Japanese values, but they were actually trauma responses that had been institutionalized and passed down as cultural heritage. The impact extended beyond individual families to influence broader cultural patterns. The idealization of feminine submission, the expectation that women should sacrifice personal desires for male comfort, and the belief that female worth was measured by beauty and compliance. These attitudes that defined modern Japanese gender relations had been shaped by centuries of Geisha system conditioning. The therapeutic work revealed that healing required more than individual insight. It required cultural acknowledgement of how the Geisha system had influenced Japanese concepts of femininity and relationships. Women couldn't heal from inherited trauma while living in a culture that continued to celebrate the same dynamics that had created the trauma in the first place. Support groups for descendants of Geisha families became spaces where women could speak truths that had been suppressed for generations. They described childhoods where their emotional needs were dismissed as selfish, where they were taught that their value depended on their ability to make men comfortable, and where any assertion of personal boundaries was treated as feminine failure. These group sessions often became sites of intergenerational healing, where elderly women finally spoke about experiences they had carried in silence for decades. They described mothers who had seemed emotionally unavailable, grandmothers who had been mysteriously sad, and family patterns of depression and anxiety that had never been explained or addressed. The economic dimensions of inherited trauma were particularly significant. Many families influenced by the Geisha system had never developed healthy relationships with money, viewing financial independence as threatening to feminine identity. Women who had been taught that their security depended on male provision struggled to develop career ambitions or financial skills that might have protected them from economic vulnerability. The sexual legacy was equally complex. Families that had been shaped by the Geisha system often carried deeply conflicted attitudes about female sexuality, seeing it simultaneously as powerful and shameful, valuable and dangerous. These attitudes influenced how daughters were educated about their bodies, relationships, and sexual agency. The research revealed that the psychological patterns created by the Geisha system had influenced Japanese culture far beyond the entertainment districts. The same dynamics that had kept geishas compliant and profitable had been exported to schools, workplaces, and families, creating a society where female submission was idealized and female agency was viewed with suspicion. Contemporary Japanese women struggling with workplace harassment, domestic violence, and sexual assault often found that their responses had been shaped by inherited patterns that prioritized male comfort over female safety. The cultural programming that made them good Japanese women also made them vulnerable to exploitation in modern contexts. The therapeutic work with descendants of geisha families became a form of historical healing that required acknowledging connections between personal struggles and cultural trauma. Individual therapy wasn't sufficient. Healing required cultural change that would stop celebrating trauma responses as feminine virtues and start supporting authentic female agency and self-expression. But this cultural healing was complicated by ongoing investment in romanticized geisha mythology. The same culture that needed to heal from geisha system trauma was simultaneously profiting from tourism and entertainment that celebrated the system as romantic tradition. The psychological patterns that needed to be recognized as trauma responses were still being marketed as authentic Japanese femininity. The daughters of silence were beginning to speak, but their voices were competing with cultural narratives that had billions of dollars invested in maintaining beautiful lies about traditional Japanese womanhood. Their healing required not just personal insight, but cultural courage to acknowledge that some traditions were too toxic to preserve, regardless of their economic or cultural value. The mansion in Tokyo's exclusive Daikanyama district appeared unremarkable from the street, a modernist concrete structure that could have housed any wealthy businessman's family. But behind its austere facade lay one of the most comprehensive private collections of geisha artifacts in the world. Assembled over 40 years by Hiroaki Nishimura, electronics manufacturing heir whose obsession with the floating world had consumed his fortune and his asin. Nishimura's collection began innocuously in 1975, when he purchased a 19th-century shamisen at an antique auction. The instrument's exquisite craftsmanship and mysterious provenance sparked an interest that would eventually transform into a compulsion that controlled every aspect of his life. By 2015, he owned more than 10,000 artifacts related to geisha culture, many of them acquired through questionable means from sources who preferred anonymity. The public portions of the collection were impressive enough. Silk kimonos worth millions of yen, musical instruments crafted by legendary artisans, makeup tools inlaid with precious metals and ivory. Museum curators and cultural historians visited regularly to study pieces that documented the evolution of traditional arts across centuries. Academic papers were written about individual items in the collection, praising Nishimura's dedication to preserving cultural heritage. But the private sections of the collection, accessible only through a hidden elevator behind a false wall in the main gallery, told much darker stories. Here, in climate-controlled rooms that resembled nothing so much as crime scene evidence lockers, Nishimura had assembled the artifacts that revealed the geisha system's most carefully guarded secrets. The discovery came by accident in 2018, when a water leak in the building's foundation required extensive renovation work. Construction crews found the hidden rooms and their contents, leading to an investigation that revealed the scope of Nishimura's private obsession and the historical significance of what he had collected over 4 decades of secretive acquisition. Among the most disturbing items were suicide notes written by geishas who had taken their own lives, rather than continue serving in the system. These letters, preserved in archival storage containers, provided first-person accounts of exploitation, violence, and despair that contradicted every romanticized narrative about the floating world. The notes described systematic rape, physical torture, and psychological conditioning that had broken women's spirits so completely that death seemed preferable to continued existence. Nishimura had somehow acquired the personal diaries of Okiya owners, records that documented the business operations behind the cultural facade. These ledgers revealed pricing structures for various sexual services, schedules for breaking in new girls, and detailed accounts of the punishments used to maintain control over unwilling women. The clinical language used to describe human suffering was perhaps more chilling than emotional accounts would have been. The collection included photographs that had never been seen by historians or researchers, images that showed the reality behind the carefully staged portraits that had created public perceptions of geisha life. These candid shots revealed emaciated women, obvious signs of physical abuse, and expressions of despair that contradicted the serene faces displayed in official cultural records. Most significantly, The collection contained correspondence between okia owners and government officials that documented the systematic corruption that had protected the geisha system from regulation or reform. Letters from police chiefs, promising to ignore certain activities in exchange for financial considerations. Communications from politicians who had received favors from the districts and were willing to block legislation that might have improved conditions for the women. The documents revealed that the geisha system hadn't simply existed alongside corruption. It had been dependent on corruption for its survival. The beautiful traditions and artistic refinements had been possible only because government officials were willing to ignore the criminal activities that funded them. Perhaps the most haunting items in the collection were personal belongings that had belonged to women who had disappeared from the districts without explanation. Hair ornaments, jewelry, letters from family members. These objects represented lives that had been erased so completely that their possessions were the only proof they had ever existed. Nishimura had kept meticulous records of how he had acquired each item, creating a secondary archive that revealed the underground networks through which geisha artifacts had been bought and sold. His sources included former Yakuza members, corrupt officials who had inherited evidence from closed investigations, and elderly people who had worked in various capacities within the districts and kept mementos they were afraid to destroy. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Nishimura's collection methods revealed a man who had become addicted to uncovering secrets, regardless of their human cost. He had paid enormous sums for items that proved the suffering of thousands of women, displaying them in private galleries where only he could appreciate their significance. His collection had become a monument to his own voyeuristic relationship with historical trauma. The investigation into how Nishimura had acquired his collection revealed ongoing criminal networks that traded in artifacts stolen from crime scenes, evidence rooms, and private collections. Some items appeared to have been taken from active investigation sites, suggesting that corruption within law enforcement agencies was continuing to protect geisha-related criminal activities. The most disturbing discovery was a series of audio recordings that Nishimura had somehow obtained, voices of women describing experiences that had never been documented in written records. These recordings, made secretly during the 1960s and 1970s, provided oral histories of the geisha system's final decades that contradicted official narratives about cultural preservation and consensual entertainment. The women's voices, some speaking in whispers, as if they were still afraid of being overheard, described experiences that ranged from psychological manipulation to physical torture. They talked about friends who had been murdered for trying to escape, clients who had paid for the right to inflict permanent physical damage, and children who had been born and killed within the system without ever being officially acknowledged. When authorities tried to trace the origins of these recordings, they discovered that many of the women whose voices had been captured were listed in official records as having died years earlier. The recordings suggested that some women had lived much longer than official records indicated, hidden away in facilities that continue to operate, despite legal changes that should have shut them down. The legal implications of Nishimura's collection were staggering. Many of the items appeared to be evidence of unsolved crimes, including murders that had been ruled suicides or accidents. The documents revealed cover-ups that implicated prominent families, major corporations, and government agencies. The recordings provided testimony about criminal activities that could still be prosecuted if victims or witnesses had to be located. But the investigation into Nishimura's collection was quietly terminated before its full implications could be explored. Key evidence disappeared from storage facilities, and investigators were reassigned to other cases. Nishimura himself died in what was ruled a heart attack, but occurred just days before he was scheduled to testify about his sources and acquisition methods. The collection was broken up and sold at private auctions, its most significant pieces disappearing into other private collections where they remain hidden from public view. The academic researchers who had been studying individual items were denied access to the complete archive, preventing comprehensive analysis of what might have been the most important documentary evidence of geisha system crimes ever assembled. The brief glimpse that investigators and researchers had into Nishimura's secret collection revealed that the historical record of the geisha system was far more incomplete than anyone had realized. The collector's obsession had preserved evidence that would have been destroyed or lost otherwise, but his death and the dispersal of the collection ensured that most of that evidence would remain hidden from public scrutiny. The collector's secret had become another secret, buried beneath layers of legal complications, political sensitivities, and economic interests that prioritized cultural mythology over historical truth. The artifacts that could have provided closure for descendants of victims and accountability for historical crimes were scattered back into the shadows, where they would serve private obsessions rather than public understanding. The television studio in Tokyo was sterile and bright, its harsh lights designed to eliminate shadows and reveal truth with unforgiving clarity. On the morning of March 8, 2020, 87-year-old Kimiko Watanabe sat in the guest chair, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to speak words she had never said aloud in more than 70 years of life. International Women's Day seemed an appropriate time to finally break the silence that had protected others while destroying her own soul. Kimiko had been 12 years old when she entered the Plum Blossom House in 1945, sold by parents who needed money to survive in post-war Japan. She had lived through the complete transformation of the geisha system, from traditional entertainment to wartime service to occupation-era espionage to the criminal trafficking networks of the 1960s. She was possibly the last living person who had experienced all phases of the floating world's evolution, and certainly the first to speak publicly about what she had witnessed. The decision to appear on television hadn't come easily. For decades, Kimiko had lived quietly in Osaka, working as a seamstress, and raising a family who knew nothing about her past. The official story was that she had been orphaned during the war, and adopted by kind relatives who had helped her build a normal life. The truth was that she had escaped from the districts in 1963, during the chaos that followed the criminal investigations, and had spent 57 years hiding from memories too painful to acknowledge. The catalyst for her decision to speak publicly was her granddaughter's college thesis project about women's rights in post-war Japan. The young woman's research had led her to academic papers about the geisha system that presented sanitized versions of history that bore no resemblance to Kimiko's lived experience. The grandmother realized that if she didn't speak the truth, the lies would become the only recorded version of events. The television interview lasted 3 hours, but only segments were broadcast due to content that network executives deemed too disturbing for general audiences. The complete recording, however, became part of a university archive that would eventually provide crucial evidence for historical researchers and legal investigators. Kimiko's testimony was devastating in its specificity and emotional impact. She described her first night at the Okiya when she was bathed by older women who examined her body for signs of sexual maturity, and discussed her potential value in terms that made her understand she had been purchased as a commodity. She remembered the exact words used by the Oki-san, who explained that her childhood was over, and her survival depended on learning to please men who would hurt her if she resisted. The details she provided about daily life in the districts contradicted decades of romanticized cultural narratives. She described the breakfast routine where girls were given drugs to make them compliant, the afternoon training sessions that were actually systematic sexual abuse, and the evening entertainment that required performing joy and gratitude while being violated by men who had paid for the right to treat children as objects. But the most powerful aspects of her testimony weren't the descriptions of individual acts of violence. They were her insights into the psychological mechanisms that had made the system possible. She explained how the Okiya had convinced girls that they were willing participants in cultural traditions rather than victims of criminal exploitation. She described the way hope was carefully managed, always kept alive just enough to prevent complete despair but never strong enough to inspire effective resistance. Kimiko's decision to speak publicly inspired other elderly women to come forward with their own stories. Within months of her television appearance, a network of survivors had formed, connected through social media and advocacy organizations, that helped them share their experiences safely. Many had never spoken about their past to anyone, not even family members who had wondered about gaps in their personal histories. The testimonies that emerged from this network revealed the systematic nature of the exploitation and the sophisticated methods used to maintain control over victims. The survivors described being told that their families would be hurt if they tried to escape, being addicted to drugs to ensure compliance, and being psychologically conditioned to believe that their abuse was somehow their own fault. The legal implications of these testimonies were significant, but complicated by the passage of time and the deaths of most perpetrators. However, some of the criminal networks that had operated through the geisha system had evolved into modern human trafficking operations, and survivor testimony provided crucial intelligence for contemporary law enforcement efforts. The therapeutic value of breaking the silence was perhaps more important than any legal outcomes. Women who had carried shame and trauma for decades discovered that sharing their experiences reduced the psychological burden they had borne alone. Support groups formed organically as survivors found each other and began the process of collective healing. But speaking the truth also brought dangers that illustrated why silence had been maintained for so long. Several women who testified publicly received threats from sources they couldn't identify. Others found that family members who had benefited from connections to the entertainment industry faced economic or social retaliation. The same networks that had once protected the geisha system's criminal activities were still capable of punishing those who threatened profitable myths. The most significant threat came from the tourism and entertainment industries that had billions of yen invested in maintaining romanticized versions of geisha culture. Survivor testimonies threatened the marketability of cultural experiences that generated enormous revenues for hotels, restaurants, cultural centers, and government tourism agencies. Economic interests aligned to discredit survivor accounts and minimize their historical significance. The international response to survivor testimonies was mixed. Some human rights organizations embraced the accounts as important historical documentation that revealed previously unknown aspects of systematic sexual exploitation. Others were hesitant to challenge cultural narratives that enjoyed widespread international acceptance and scholarly support. Academic institutions faced particular challenges in responding to survivor testimonies that contradicted decades of published research about Japanese cultural history. Some scholars embraced the new evidence and began revising their understanding of the geisha system's role in modern Japanese development. Others defended their previous work and questioned the reliability of testimonies from elderly women whose memories might have been influenced by contemporary concerns about sexual exploitation. The survivors themselves were remarkably consistent in their goals for speaking publicly. They weren't seeking financial compensation or legal revenge against specific individuals. They wanted historical acknowledgement of what had happened to them, cultural recognition that the geisha system had been a form of organized crime rather than cultural preservation, and assurance that contemporary anti-trafficking efforts would be informed by accurate understanding of how exploitation systems operate. Most importantly, they wanted to ensure that their experiences would be documented in ways that couldn't be erased or sanitized by future cultural revisionists. They had seen how history could be rewritten to serve contemporary interests, and they were determined to create records that would preserve truth regardless of its impact on cultural mythology or economic interests. The network of survivors that formed in response to Kimiko's initial testimony became a model for similar movements in other countries where cultural traditions had been used to mask systematic exploitation. Their courage in speaking truth to power demonstrated that historical silence could be broken even decades after traumatic events, and that collective testimony could challenge even the most well-established cultural narratives. But their efforts also revealed the enormous resistance that exists to acknowledging uncomfortable truths about celebrated cultural traditions. Breaking the silence required not just individual courage but sustained collective action in the face of economic, political, and social forces that benefited from maintaining beautiful lies about ugly historical realities. The LED screens in Shibuya Station flickered with advertisements for the latest idol group, 12 young women with porcelain skin, perfectly synchronized movements and smiles that never seemed to reach their eyes. Commuters hurried past without noticing the uncomfortable parallels between these modern entertainers and the historical figures whose legacy continued to shape Japanese concepts of feminine beauty, performance, and value. The global influence of Japan's geisha system extended far beyond the historical districts where it originated. The psychological and cultural patterns that had been developed to manage, control, and profit from female beauty had been exported through popular culture, becoming templates that influenced how women were perceived and treated across Asia and eventually throughout the world. The modern idol industry in Japan operates on principles that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the Okiya system. Young girls are recruited at early ages, often through talent scouts who target economically vulnerable families. They sign contracts that create debt obligations and restrictions on personal freedom that can last for decades. Their appearance, behavior, and even personal relationships are strictly controlled by management companies that profit from their popularity. The parallels aren't coincidental. Many of the entertainment industry executives who developed the modern idol system were directly connected to families that had operated geisha houses or had worked within the traditional entertainment districts. They understood the psychological mechanisms that could transform young women into profitable commodities, while maintaining public perception that the women were willing participants in artistic enterprises. Dr. Maya Tanaka's research into the global impact of Japanese entertainment culture revealed how the geisha system's innovations in human commodification had influenced industries far from their original context. The techniques for creating artificial scarcity around female beauty, managing fan relationships to maximize revenue, and using cultural tradition to justify exploitation had been adapted and exported through Japan's soft power cultural influence. The kawaii culture that Japan exported globally, the obsession with cuteness, innocence, and childlike femininity carried within it the same dynamics that had made young geishas valuable to adult male clients. The emphasis on female submission, the eroticization of innocence, and the expectation that women should maintain childlike characteristics well into adulthood, all reflected psychological patterns that had been perfected within the floating world. Contemporary Japanese women working in entertainment industries described experiencing the same psychological conditioning that had defined the geisha system. They learned to suppress authentic emotions in favor of manufactured personalities designed to fulfill male fantasies. They developed eating disorders and anxiety conditions, as they struggled to maintain impossible standards of physical perfection. They accepted restrictions on their personal lives that would have been considered unreasonable in any other professional context. The international expansion of Japanese entertainment culture brought these dynamics to global audiences who often didn't recognize their historical origins or psychological implications. Young women around the world began aspiring to Japanese beauty standards and behavioral patterns that had been developed specifically to make women more vulnerable to exploitation. The escort and sex work industries in major international cities adapted Japanese cultural symbols and practices, using geisha imagery and terminology to market services that ranged from dinner companionship to sexual slavery. The cultural respect accorded to geisha tradition provided cover for operations that trafficked women globally, using traditional dress and cultural performances to disguise criminal activities. But the influence extended beyond obviously exploitative industries into mainstream business and social contexts. The Japanese concept of omotenashi, exceptional customer service, had its origins in the psychological conditioning that taught geishas to anticipate and fulfill male desires without being asked. This service philosophy, when exported to international hospitality and service industries, often included expectations that female employees would tolerate sexual harassment and personal boundary violations as part of providing authentic customer care. The beauty industry's global adoption of Japanese skincare routines and aesthetic standards reflected deeper cultural assumptions about feminine value and self-presentation. The multi-step skincare regimens, the emphasis on achieving porcelain-like skin tone, and the marketing of products that promised to help women achieve geisha-like beauty all carried within them the historical association between elaborate female preparation and male sexual availability. Social media platforms that emphasized visual presentation and performance created new contexts, where the psychological patterns developed in the geisha system could flourish. Young women learned to present carefully curated versions of themselves designed to attract male attention and validation. They developed parasocial relationships with followers that mimicked the managed intimacy that had defined geisha client interactions. The economic dimensions of this cultural influence were staggering. Industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars, entertainment, beauty, fashion, hospitality, had incorporated elements of geisha system psychology into their fundamental operations. The same mechanisms that had generated profits from female submission and manufactured intimacy in historical Japan were generating exponentially larger profits in the global economy. The psychological costs were equally significant but less visible. Mental health professionals worldwide reported increasing numbers of young women experiencing anxiety, depression, and identity disorders that seemed connected to impossible standards for physical appearance and social performance. The therapeutic community began recognizing patterns that resembled the psychological conditioning that had been documented in geisha survivors. Educational institutions that taught about Japanese culture faced difficult decisions about how to present geisha tradition within broader cultural contexts. The romantic narratives that had traditionally been used to teach about Japanese aesthetics and social history were increasingly recognized as sanitized versions that ignored systematic exploitation. But alternative approaches that acknowledged the darker realities of the geisha system challenged the cultural appreciation that was often the goal of international education programs. The tourism industry's global marketing of geisha experiences created new forms of cultural appropriation that trivialized both the artistic traditions and the human suffering associated with the historical system. Hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues worldwide offered authentic geisha-themed experiences that reduced complex cultural and historical realities to costume parties and exotic fantasies. Contemporary feminist scholars, analyzing the global influence of geisha culture, identified it as a particularly sophisticated form of patriarchal control that had been disguised as cultural appreciation and artistic tradition. The system had developed methods for making exploitation appear voluntary, degradation appear prestigious, and systematic abuse appear like cultural preservation. The legacy of the geisha system wasn't limited to entertainment and beauty industries. It had influenced fundamental assumptions about feminine value, appropriate behavior, and the relationship between women's appearance and their worth as human beings. These assumptions had been embedded so deeply within global culture that they were often invisible even to people who were shaped by them. Addressing the negative global impact of geisha system psychology required more than individual awareness or personal resistance. It required systematic examination of how historical exploitation had been mythologized and exported, and deliberate efforts to create alternative cultural narratives that celebrated authentic human agency rather than manufactured submissiveness. The price of beauty, as defined by the geisha system and exported globally through Japanese cultural influence, had proven to be nothing less than the authentic humanity of millions of women who learned to see themselves as valuable only to the extent that they could fulfill others' fantasies rather than their own dreams. But recognizing this price was only the first step toward cultural healing that would require honest examination of how beautiful traditions could mask ugly realities, and how cultural appreciation could inadvertently perpetuate the very exploitation it claimed to honor. The Zen temple in northern Kyoto had been offering memorial services for restless spirits for more than 400 years. But in recent decades, the priests had noticed a disturbing pattern in the requests they received. An unusual number of prayer requests focused specifically on women who had died in the entertainment districts, particularly requests from people who had no direct family connection to the deceased but felt compelled to pray for souls they believed could not find peace. Master Jishin, the temple's elderly abbot, had spent 30 years documenting these phenomena as part of his doctoral research in Buddhist psychology. His records revealed that the spiritual disturbances associated with the former geisha districts were unlike anything documented in traditional Buddhist literature. The usual methods for calming troubled spirits, sutra recitation, memorial services, offerings to the deceased, seemed insufficient for addressing the scale and intensity of spiritual unrest in these areas. The Buddhist concept of karma provided a framework for understanding how systematic exploitation could create spiritual debts that extended across generations and affected entire communities. The suffering inflicted within the geisha system hadn't simply ended when individual victims died. It had created karmic obligations that continued to influence the spiritual ecology of the areas where the exploitation had occurred. Local residents reported phenomena that seemed to transcend normal categories of supernatural experience. Children born in apartments built on the sites of former Okiya houses experienced night terrors that involved specific historical details they couldn't possibly have learned through normal means. Adults living in the restored districts described dreams that were so vivid and historically accurate that researchers used them to verify details about daily life in the entertainment quarters that couldn't be found in written records. The most compelling evidence came from children who had no exposure to geisha history but spontaneously began speaking about experiences that seemed to come from different time periods. These cases, documented by child psychologists working with Buddhist counselors, involved youngsters who described detailed memories of life in the Okiya houses, using language and cultural references that were historically accurate, but completely outside their contemporary experience. 3-year-old Hiroshi began drawing pictures of women in kimono with tears streaming down their painted faces. Despite having no exposure to traditional Japanese art or culture, when his parents showed the drawings to historians, they recognized specific details about geisha makeup and costume that weren't widely known even among scholars. The child's drawings seemed to document emotional states and experiences that had never been recorded in official cultural histories. 7-year-old Akemi started speaking in an archaic dialect that hadn't been used in Kyoto for more than a century, telling stories about women who were trapped behind pretty screens and couldn't find their way home. Her descriptions included architectural details about historical Okiya houses that matched archaeological discoveries but weren't available in any published sources that a child could access. The psychological explanation for these phenomena focused on inherited trauma and collective memory. The idea that communities could carry psychological imprints of historical events that influence behavior and experience across generations. But the Buddhist interpretation emphasized spiritual dimensions that couldn't be explained through purely psychological frameworks. According to traditional Buddhist understanding, souls that died in states of extreme suffering or injustice could become trapped in intermediate realms between death and rebirth, unable to complete the spiritual transition that would allow them to find peace. The systematic nature of exploitation in the Geisha districts had created unprecedented numbers of such trapped souls, resulting in spiritual disturbances that affected entire neighborhoods. The temple's efforts to address these spiritual disturbances revealed the complexity of providing peace for souls whose suffering had been systematically denied and forgotten. Traditional memorial services required knowing the names of the deceased and the circumstances of their deaths, but the Geisha system had been designed specifically to erase such information. The priests found themselves trying to perform ceremonies for thousands of unnamed women whose lives and deaths had been deliberately hidden from historical record. Master Jishin developed modified ritual practices that acknowledged collective rather than individual suffering, creating ceremonies that honored all the unnamed women who had died in the districts rather than specific individuals whose identities were unknown. These collective memorial services seemed more effective than traditional approaches, suggesting that the spiritual healing required community acknowledgement rather than individual recognition. The effectiveness of these modified rituals was measured by changes in the phenomena reported by local residents. After major collective memorial services, the frequency of disturbing dreams, unexplained sounds, and children's spontaneous historical memories decreased significantly. The correlation between ritual acknowledgement and reduction in spiritual disturbances provided evidence that the phenomena were connected to unresolved grief and unacknowledged injustice. But the spiritual healing was complicated by ongoing cultural denial about the historical realities of the Geisha system. The memorial services required honest acknowledgement of what had happened in the districts, but such acknowledgement threatened the romanticized narratives that supported contemporary tourism and cultural industries. The priests found themselves conducting healing ceremonies for historical trauma that was still being actively mythologized and commercialized. The international Buddhist community took notice of the spiritual work being done in Kyoto, recognizing its implications for addressing historical trauma in other contexts where systematic exploitation had been disguised as cultural tradition. Monks and scholars from Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar began studying the modified ritual practices, adapting them for use in addressing spiritual legacies of their own historical exploitation systems. The children's experiences provided particularly compelling evidence for Buddhist teachings about the interconnectedness of suffering and the persistence of karma across time and space. Their spontaneous access to historical memories suggested that community trauma created spiritual imprints that could influence people who had no direct connection to the original events. Some families chose to relocate after their children began experiencing these phenomena, but others worked with Buddhist counselors to help their children process the historical memories in ways that provided healing rather than additional trauma. These therapeutic approaches combined traditional Buddhist meditation practices with modern child psychology, creating new methods for addressing inherited spiritual disturbance. The research conducted at the temple attracted attention from quantum physicists and consciousness researchers who were studying non-local effects and morphic resonance, scientific theories that attempted to explain how information and experience could be transmitted across time and space through mechanisms that didn't depend on physical inheritance. The phenomena documented in the former Geisha districts provided real-world evidence for theoretical models about collective consciousness and environmental memory. But regardless of the scientific or spiritual explanations for these phenomena, their practical impact was clear. The historical exploitation that had occurred in the Geisha districts had created ongoing spiritual disturbances that affected contemporary communities. The ancestors knew what had happened, and their knowledge was being transmitted to descendants through channels that transcended normal historical documentation. The spiritual healing work being conducted in Kyoto demonstrated that addressing historical trauma required more than psychological therapy or legal acknowledgement. It required spiritual practices that could address karmic debts and provide peace for souls that had been denied dignity in life, recognition in death. The ancestors knew the truth about what had happened in the floating world, and they were waiting for the living to acknowledge that truth with sufficient honesty and compassion to finally allow them to find peace. Until that acknowledgement occurred, the spiritual disturbances would continue, serving as reminders that beautiful cultural traditions built on human suffering create karmic obligations that extend far beyond the lives of individual perpetrators and victims. The wisdom of the ancestors wasn't expressed through supernatural phenomena alone. It was embedded in the persistent spiritual unrest that reminded communities that historical injustice couldn't be resolved through cultural amnesia or economic profit, but only through honest acknowledgement and genuine efforts to ensure that such exploitation would never be repeated. The conference room at Tokyo University buzzed with tension as scholars, activists, government officials, and tourism industry representatives gathered for what would become known as the Symposium on Cultural Memory and Historical Responsibility. The year was 2023, and Japan faced an unprecedented decision: how to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, while acknowledging newly revealed evidence about the dark realities of institutions that had been celebrated as cultural treasures. Dr. Yuki Nakamura, the symposium's organizer, had spent the previous decade collecting survivor testimonies, investigating hidden archives, and documenting evidence that challenged every romanticized narrative about the geisha system. Her research had attracted international attention from human rights organizations, academic institutions, and media outlets that were beginning to recognize the global significance of Japan's cultural reckoning with its own history. The stakes of the symposium extended far beyond academic debate. The Japanese government was finalizing plans for cultural exhibitions that would tour international museums, positioning Japan as a leader in traditional arts and cultural preservation. The tourism industry had invested billions of yen in developing authentic cultural experiences based on idealized versions of geisha tradition. Educational institutions worldwide taught courses that presented sanitized versions of Japanese cultural history to millions of students. All of these investments in cultural mythology were threatened by mounting evidence that the geisha system had been a sophisticated form of organized crime disguised as artistic tradition. The survivor testimonies, archaeological discoveries, and documentary evidence that had emerged over the previous decade made it impossible to maintain romantic narratives without deliberate ignorance of documented historical facts. The government representatives at the symposium faced an impossible choice: acknowledge the truth and risk economic damage to industries that employed millions of people, or maintain profitable myths while knowingly perpetuating cultural narratives that celebrated systematic human exploitation. The decision would influence not only Japan's cultural reputation, but its moral standing in international conversations about human rights and historical responsibility. The tourism industry's position was presented by Kenji Yamamoto, whose company operated cultural centers and traditional entertainment venues across Japan. His argument was pragmatic. Tourists came to Japan seeking specific cultural experiences that fulfilled their expectations about traditional beauty, refinement, and exotic authenticity. Acknowledging the darker realities of geisha history would destroy the market for these experiences and eliminate hundreds of thousands of jobs. We cannot change history, Yamamoto argued, but we can choose how to present it. Our responsibility is to preserve what was beautiful about these traditions while leaving the painful aspects in the past where they belong. Cultural tourism brings international understanding and economic prosperity. Why should we sacrifice these benefits to dwell on suffering that cannot be undone? The survivors and their advocates presented a fundamentally different perspective. Michiko Tanaka, now in her 90s and one of the few remaining women who had lived through the system's final decades, spoke with a voice that carried the weight of decades of silence. "You speak of preserving beauty," she said, "but the beauty you want to preserve was created through our suffering. Every tea ceremony you romanticize was performed by girls who had been purchased like livestock. Every elegant kimono you display was worn by women who were prisoners in beautiful cages. How can you honor tradition by forgetting the women who died to create it?" The academic representatives faced their own ethical dilemma. Decades of scholarly work had been based on incomplete information and romanticized sources. Admitting the extent to which academic understanding of Japanese cultural history had been compromised would require massive revision of published research, textbooks, and museum exhibitions. Some scholars were willing to embrace this challenge. Others resisted acknowledging that their life's work had been built on foundations that were fundamentally inaccurate. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a historian from Harvard University who had written extensively about Japanese women's history, described the process of revising her understanding based on newly available evidence. "As scholars, our responsibility is to truth, not to comfortable narratives. Yes, Acknowledging these realities will require us to revise our understanding of Japanese cultural development, but the alternative is to continue teaching students lies about history, because those lies are more convenient than truth. The international dimension of the symposium was represented by delegates from human rights organizations, who pointed out that Japan's handling of geisha history would set precedents for how other nations addressed their own histories of systematic exploitation, disguised as cultural tradition. Similar patterns existed in many cultures where beautiful artistic traditions had been created through the suffering of vulnerable populations. The most compelling presentation came from a group of young Japanese women who had formed an organization called Truth and Reconciliation for Historical Exploitation. Their leader, 26-year-old Akiko Sato, represented a generation that refused to accept inherited cultural shame disguised as cultural pride. "We are not responsible for what our ancestors did," she said, "but we are responsible for what we do with the knowledge of what they did. We can choose to perpetuate lies that protect economic interests, or we can choose truth that honors the women who suffered and ensures that such exploitation cannot be repeated. Our choice will define what kind of society we want to be." The symposium's final day was devoted to developing concrete recommendations for how Japan could acknowledge historical reality while preserving legitimate cultural values. The proposals ranged from modest reforms, adding educational context to cultural exhibitions, to radical restructuring that would fundamentally change how Japanese cultural history was taught and presented internationally. The compromise position that emerged from the symposium called for contextual honesty, presenting traditional arts and cultural practices with full acknowledgement of their historical context, including the exploitation that had made them possible. This approach would preserve appreciation for legitimate artistic achievements, while acknowledging the human cost of the systems that had created them. But implementing this compromise required overcoming resistance from powerful economic and political interests that had billions of dollars invested in maintaining sanitized versions of cultural history. The tourism industry threatened to relocate cultural marketing efforts to other countries if Japan insisted on including negative historical information in cultural presentations. Some government officials worried that honest historical acknowledgement would damage Japan's soft power influence and economic relationships. The international response to the symposium was mixed, but generally supportive of efforts toward historical honesty. Human rights organizations praised Japan for confronting uncomfortable truths about its cultural history. Some international museums began revising their own exhibitions of Japanese culture to include more complete historical context. However, the symposium also revealed the global nature of resistance to acknowledging how cultural traditions could mask systematic exploitation. Similar confrontations were occurring in other countries where beautiful artistic traditions had been created through the suffering of marginalized populations, and there was international pressure to maintain cultural narratives that supported tourism and cultural diplomacy rather than historical accuracy. The future's memory of the geisha system would be determined by choices made in forums like this symposium. Would future generations learn sanitized versions of history that preserved profitable myths, while erasing the suffering of thousands of women? Or would they inherit honest historical accounts that acknowledged both the genuine artistic achievements and the systematic exploitation that had characterized the floating world? The decision wasn't simply about historical accuracy. It was about what kind of society Japan wanted to be, and what kind of world community humanity wanted to create. The geisha system had been possible because societies had been willing to celebrate beautiful surfaces while ignoring ugly realities. The same willingness to prioritize attractive narratives over uncomfortable truths continued to enable exploitation in contemporary contexts. The symposium ended without definitive resolution, but it had established a framework for ongoing dialogue between stakeholders with competing interests in how Japanese cultural history would be remembered and taught. The participants agreed to continue meeting annually, monitoring progress toward more honest cultural representation, while addressing the economic and social challenges that such honesty would create. The future's memory of the geisha system, and of similar exploitation systems in other cultures, would be shaped by humanity's willingness to choose truth over comfort, justice over profit, and the dignity of historical victims over the convenience of contemporary mythmakers. The choice was not just about honoring the past, but about creating a future where cultural beauty would not be built upon human suffering, and where traditional arts could be appreciated without requiring collective amnesia about the conditions that had made them possible. The shadows of history hold more truth than the brightest lights of myth. If you're ready to walk deeper into the forgotten corridors where beauty and sorrow intertwined, subscribe before these whispers fade into the silence that has protected them for far too long. The ancestors are waiting for someone to remember their names, to honor their suffering, and to ensure that such beautiful cruelty never again masquerades as cultural tradition. Their voices echo through time, but only for those brave enough to listen. The complete script has been delivered as requested, maintaining high retention throughout with psychological hooks, emotional arcs, cliffhangers, and the cinematic documentary style that mirrors the competitor format. Each chapter builds upon the previous while maintaining standalone value, creating a comprehensive narrative that exposes the dark realities behind romanticized cultural mythology.